to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen.
With me today is abundance teacher and money coach, Jody Lynn Craven.
This is your daily dose of happy. We are so happy you decided to join us today.
Now, Jody Lynn, you've been doing the show with me for like, what, 14 months, something like that, right? So you've gotten to know me pretty well. And I think you've pretty much figured out by now, I'm not the kind of guy who curses a lot. I don't use a lot of swear words or anything like that. And part of the reason is because I think that if you're going to have something like that, you use it when it's really appropriate. You know, it has more impact that way, right?
Yeah.
That rule has basically been taken out of my hands today because our guest is the host of the podcast. Who the fuck?
I love it.
Nikki LaCroce, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, and thank you for compromising with the name of my show, because I will say it quite literally developed out of me asking that question to myself and really thinking, who the fuck am I? Like, what is going on in my life, and do I even want the life that I have? Do I believe the things that I've been taught? And so it, as much as I think has the shock value for a lot of people, it definitely doesn't do a service to what the show really entails and the depth of the conversations and the integrity of the conversations. So from a brand perspective, I really love it. And I also think that, at some point or another, whether or not we drop the F-bomb in that question or not, we've asked ourselves, who am I and what is my life? So it certainly came from a place of authenticity, if nothing else.
Yeah.
I totally relate to that. Yeah.
I relate to it on the level that I kind of started my podcast for a similar reason.
I saw that. I really enjoyed that.
I needed help. I needed a lot of help. What better way to do it than with a podcast, right? Because you talk to all these amazing people, you learn all this crazy stuff, get people like Jody Lynn on as co-hosts. I mean, what could be better than that, really?
Absolutely. I mean, human connection is the point of all of it, right? And I really was inspired by what you've been doing and how long you've been doing this for, Walt. So I'm so glad that I'm able to join. And I love that you have a consistent schedule, because it makes it really easy to know, if I'm available, and I can make it work, because time zones are, I think, the biggest barrier to a lot of things happening when it comes to podcasting.
Yeah, no kidding. That's true. Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges. And I used to try to do, excuse me, I used to try to do what many people do, which is, here's my calendar, let's see if we can find a time. And that actually created more problems.
Yes.
It's actually better when you said, okay, here's what the schedule is. Can you match it?
Yes, I actually just did that somewhat recently, and I took the month of July off from recording episodes for my show, because I had a bunch backlogged, and I was just like, I can't take on anymore. I've given way too much of my availability, and now I don't have time to do the things like the back of house stuff where you're like, oh, right, no, I still have to produce the show and make things happen. So when is that actually going to occur if I've blocked every single hour of my free time? So I totally respect that. I had the same revelation myself somewhere recently.
Yeah. Well, you learn it pretty quick. I mean, it kind of overcomes you. You don't have a lot of choice. It's like, okay, it's in your face. What are you going to do with it? Because it's not going anywhere.
And if people are interested and they're engaged, they'll either plan, aligned to that, or, I definitely am open to being flexible when time zones are really wonky.
Yeah,
so if I'm as a host that engaged and really interested in having a guest, I'll certainly say, hey, let me know if none of these times or days work for you, and we can see if we can work something out separately. But I learned that just sort of blasting everybody with my actual availability was only a detriment to my sanity. So we had to jump over that hurdle pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Jody Lynn knows about that too, because she's done enough of these. No doubt.
And I'm still like in the insanity stage. Yes.
I don't know that it ever fully goes away, because it is about consistent conversations. I was going to say content production, but I feel like that kind of diminishes the value of what you're actually trying to do, which is have meaningful conversations with people, and ergo that becomes content.
That's right. That's exactly what happens. So, all right, well, give us the lay of the land. I mean, you kind of gave us a hint about how you got the whole thing started, but how long you've been doing it? What really led up to it? Give us that little storyline.
Yeah. So I always joked around that I do nothing better, at the very least, not more than talk. And I really would love eventually for somebody to pay me to do that. And
there you go.
It's funny because I spent a good portion of my adult life in a tech career. So a lot of small and also large companies where it's better to just kind of speak when you're spoken to or answer questions succinctly and just sort of be done with it. And I'm terrible at that. And so there was a lot of like, just know when to stop, you know? And I'm like, I don't. So I actually I'm wrapping up my contract with a tech company that I've been doing since October and really going all in on the podcast and some other ventures that my wife and I have together. And so this has been an evolution over the past 4 years or so. I started in 2019, and as I mentioned earlier, it really came from a lot of introspection, very intentional introspection, because I was miserable at my job at the time. I was working for Amazon corporate as a product manager, and I was really lucky that the opportunity came about. I had been unemployed for about 6 months and kind of didn't know where I was going to go. And I really wanted to move to the West Coast. They afforded me that opportunity. So I snatched it up, kind of knowing that I probably wouldn't find a lot of fulfillment there, but trying to kind of seize the moment, as it were. And so about a year into that job, I was just so miserable, and I could tell I was just supremely unfulfilled, and trying to navigate that while working not only a corporate job, but a job at a company that is really known for its rigor, really made it hard to make time for myself. And so I started going to therapy to really figure out what is my purpose, and what am I trying to do with my life. And after about a year of therapy, I had come to the realization, asking myself a lot of the whys, why did I go down this path? Why am I doing what I'm doing, not just in work, but in life? And when I came to that point of realization that my purpose is to connect with people, I remember very distinctly, saying to my therapist, I know that my purpose is to connect with people, but I don't really know what that looks like yet. And so I had a history of starting a blog and ending a blog almost instantaneously. Like, I love writing and I always enjoyed being able to craft narratives. But for me, I really value the art of conversation, and the fact that it isn't really just a one-way street. I wanted to be engaged with other people, and I wanted to ask people to share their stories of why they became and how they became who they are. And I wanted to kind of break the demographic boundaries with the show. It was really important to me to not just hone in on this type of person doing this type of thing, but to give a platform to people who I wouldn't typically talk to, just because your paths wouldn't cross in any other capacity. I'm
Yeah.
sure the two of you have experienced that with this and other aspects of your life, right? You're like, why
Mhm.
would I ever know this person except maybe in passing? And so once I started to do that, I had such a greater sense of fulfillment. And the first season was really just mostly people I knew. The second season, I solicited guests completely unknown to me, and I was just
Yeah.
about ready to hit the gas at the end of the second season, and COVID had been going on for a bit, and I was exiting a really bad relationship. And so I pressed pause. I took about a year off and then picked up again, I think last May. Well, I guess 2 Mays ago now. And did a couple of just episodes by myself where I was processing a lot of what I'd gone through, leaving this abusive relationship. My mom passed away around the same time that
Oh,
that was
wow.
happening. So it
Wow.
was, I refer to it in retrospect as my personal Armageddon. Like, it was just, there was no way I had any mental bandwidth to come back to the mic. But when I met my now wife, and just very obviously my person, she's an avid podcast listener. And so when we met as friends, she binged my first 2 seasons and was like, "You're meant to do this. Like, when you're ready, like, I really feel like you should come back to it." And so basically, since October, I started recording again. And as of January, I've been releasing weekly. And so I really feel like I have that momentum and that passion and that drive behind it that I had, that kind of got stunted not by design, obviously. So now that it's kind of come to fruition, I'm back in the game, and I feel very inspired by the people who have shown up and been so vulnerable on the mic. Yeah, so that's a kind of the truncated but still long-winded version.
We do those all the time, no problem.
Yeah. Oh, that's
But
amazing.
it is amazing. It's also the way you described it, the way you told the story, your passion for it really comes through.
Oh, thank you. I
Very
appreciate that.
right,
I
Jody
mean, I
Lynn. I
love
mean, you can just
people.
hear it.
I love
Oh, yeah.
people, and I think you guys, I'm sure, have experienced it too, right? Everybody has a story. And so I think when I was listening to a podcast that I enjoy the other day, and somebody who has, millions of followers, and making the comment that, the more subscribers you get, the bigger guests we can get. And I said to my wife, I understand why you're saying that, and I respect why you're saying it, because I'm
Mhm.
terrible at self promotion and I need to be better at that. But at the same time, I don't know that I like sort of measuring guests in that way, because I think some of the most interesting stories I've ever heard from people are not people that are out there with their names in bright lights, And so I feel like it's kind of when you find that really great hole in the wall restaurant that you love to go to, and you're like, oh my gosh, nobody knows about this. This is amazing. Sometimes you get those stories and you just feel like your life has completely transformed because you're speaking to people who are just, they're living their life so authentically and being so vulnerable that, I mean, I don't care what your follower count is. I care that you have a place to share your story.
Totally
That's
agree.
impressive. And I think that really shines through just your entire presence being with you here today, how much you care about the conversation and how that will be amazing content and
Thank
how
you.
they're people, not numbers. And we live in such a transactional society today. It's really refreshing to meet, another business owner, a podcaster, somebody who's going after it in this way that has that authentic view of why they're doing it. It's
Totally.
beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that a lot. It's definitely, I mean, who knows how well it's serving me, to be honest, but but I think that, that's the thing too, is that I'm more comfortable playing a long game and knowing that I'm staying true to that than feeling like I'm doing something that is compromising my integrity, or sort of ethical perspective on it. And it's not to say that it's unethical to have bigger guests. I mean, by all means, if I can
No.
land them, fantastic. I
Yeah.
love it. Promote the shit out of that. Sorry, pardon my language, but it's
Oh, who
but
was that? Okay.
Now you got them started.
yeah, no. But at the same time, I think there's something to be said for taking the time to have the conversations with people who, you know, sometimes it might just take an episode to elevate that person's voice, to get them onto another podcast, to get them into another conversation. And just the people that I've met through my show who have introduced me to other people that I've been able to introduce to other people. We just had a Zoom meetup on Sunday with a bunch of people that have kind of cross collaborated across our shows. And it's been really amazing and beautiful to see how you have people literally all over the globe finding, this common space to be able to integrate and connect with each other in ways that I think a lot of times we miss out because we are, to your point, Jody Lynn, like focused on the numbers, or we're looking at like really superficial things, not because we're superficial as people, but because that's what drives the engagement, right? And so I
Mhm.
think to some degree it's that balance of what is it that you're trying to achieve, in that transactional sense, but also like what's the goal of what you're actually doing on a visceral human level.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's also a flip side to it too. In my experience, and you've been doing this long enough, you may have experienced the same kind of thing. But I once had somebody on the show who was very, very big in the law of attraction sphere, really well known, and it was one of the worst interviews I've ever had. It was
Yeah.
horrible. It was
I've never
really,
heard this
really
story, Walt.
Whereas some of the best interviews I've had have been people who were nobodies out of nowhere who had amazing things to share, or perspectives that were just like, oh, that's so refreshing, or
Totally.
or maybe not nobodies, maybe people who they had their own following. It wasn't necessarily a huge following, but they had their own following, they had their thing, they had their stuff together, and there was a connection. There was a huge connection.
Yeah.
Well, that happened with Jody Lynn. Jody Lynn came in as a guest,
Oh,
and
I love
immediately, I
that.
mean, Jody Lynn, how long did I wait before I asked you to become a co-host? I mean, it was
I
like
think
what,
at the end
minutes?
of the episode.
I
I
think
don't know,
so. Yeah,
maybe
it
like
was
a
really
week
quick.
or something. I don't even think it was a week. I think I got an email from you like the next day. Hey,
Yeah,
they're recording. And
Oh, that's
because when you get a
amazing.
connection like that, you grab it.
Yeah, well, you're spot on, Walt. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I think it's challenging. I mean, in this ever increasingly virtual space, I've worked with so many people I've never met in 3D, and you form these connections. It used to be weird, right? It used to be weird to say that you met somebody online. Now
Yeah.
it's like, if you didn't meet them online, how did you meet them? Like, were
Right.
you
Right.
just out in the wild interacting with other people? Like, who does that? How did you not vet them first? I don't know.
I mean, you actually lived in the non-virtual world. How do you do that anymore?
What is that like? And I think there's something to be said for that, because I love engaging and being in 3D with people. And I also think that, as I said, you gain these opportunities to be around people that you might not otherwise have not just a conversation with, but an extended conversation with, like really diving into the root of things. And so when you look at the element of human connection, and that's a thing that I really focus my show around, and even just in the past couple of weeks have been thinking through, and just before we hopped on this stream, to be quite honest, I was like, how am I updating my messaging to better reflect the fact that human connection is the core of what I care about and what I want this show to represent? Because it is, there's a book that Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry wrote together called What Happened to You. Have either of you heard of this?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
No.
So it's quite fascinating, very scientifically backed. And I listened to the audiobook. I kind of recommend that because of the nature of the book. I think it's more engaging that way. Plus I mean, I think Oprah inherently is a voice that we've come to know and listen to and enjoy, right? But the dialogue between them, I think, is quite dynamic. And when I listen to this, the idea is that we should stop asking people what's wrong with you, and we should start asking what happened to you, because what happened to you is what ultimately dictates who you are, who you become. And when I get to the end of this book, and spoiler alert, but like the rest of the book is worth it. The idea, scientifically speaking, is that human connection is the thing that helps us heal through trauma more than anything else, And so it's fascinating to think how, when you deal with trauma, whether that's sizable or a small amount of trauma, because we all experience it in different ways, isolation is something that a lot of people lean into when they feel traumatized. You don't trust people, you don't want to be around other people, you feel closer to, you want to be by yourself. And so when we do that, while it's our sort of reptilian brain's defense mechanism, there's this other part that is desperately craving that connection. And so if you squash that, then unfortunately you're kind of really stunting your ability to heal. And so, having gone through, as I mentioned, this really bad divorce and loss of my mom at the same time, I was very lucky, that I was already in therapy, and that I had somebody that I could talk to and deal with this in that way. But I had also been trying to help my ex deal with trauma that she had experienced. And as a function of learning about it for her, even though she didn't necessarily apply those things, I was like, cool, well, I at least already know where I need to start. So I guess fringe benefit, I'll take it, and so
Yeah,
always
sure.
a positive.
yeah, so you got to lean into those little silver linings when you can. And
That's
I
right.
think that that's what it's about, right? And the fact that the show that you're doing is, that daily dose of happy, it speaks immensely to how my mindset has changed, knowing those facts, and also the realization that gratitude is so instrumental as well. So for me, human connection and gratitude are the two keystones, if you can have two.
You can have as many as you want. I mean, that's the nice thing about rabbit hole,
Yeah, I'm like, I'm from Pennsylvania. You got to drop a Keystone State reference
Sure,
in there
yeah.
somewhere, right? But it's like they're the two most significant things that have helped me through the hardest moments in my life, and they're the things that keep me optimistic in spite of all the craziness that's happening in the world around us or in our own personal lives. And excuse me, and I really encourage that for people to lean into those two things. And as much as I was a skeptic before, I mean, I would have rolled my eyes at gratitude as hard as you can imagine. I would have rolled my eyes at therapy as hard as you can imagine. But when you go through it and you experience it and you learn to trust that, especially when you consider kind of the mindset of abundance and things like that, that it transforms how you show up in the world.
Oh,
100%.
No doubt. Yeah. You made reference to something else too a few minutes ago. You talked about having people on who may not have a big following, but how they would be somebody who had something really interesting or unique. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but they had something to say that you would not normally hear from another quarter. I've expressed that in the past in terms of whether or not it's somebody who I agree with or disagree with, and the people I disagree with are the ones that I learn from the most.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's super important to have conversations about things that we might not agree with. I remember listening to a podcast years ago, and this has stuck with me about the fact that one of our biggest mistakes is that we don't want to have the controversial conversations, because if we don't have them, then how do we really establish that what we think is as valid as we believe it to be, right? And it's not to say you can still disagree with people and have those conversations. Maybe it strengthens your opinion. Maybe it changes the way you see the world. But if you're just sitting there walking through life acting like what you think is the only way, then I mean, there's a very distinct type of person that wants to believe that. And I think that that's ultimately a disservice to them. And frankly, obviously the people around them. And you see that. I mean, power hungry
They're not
people
growing.
are a
That's
great
the problem.
example, right?
Yeah, they're not growing. They're not actually evolving as human beings. So first of all, there's nothing really more to learn from them because they haven't learned anything lately.
Right. You've maxed out.
And secondly, they're not interesting anymore. People are interesting because of the growth they're going through.
That's a really bold statement, and I agree with that 100%. Because I like myself 1,000 times better having witnessed my own growth, and then seeing the growth that other people have achieved that inspires me. You know, it's like I started going to therapy because one of my best friends was so invested in doing the work and sharing with me her experience that I could tell that it made a difference. And I was like, okay, I don't need somebody to convince me. And I've been the person that, you know, I have a lot of friends who are like, I know I should go to therapy, but, and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to convince you to go. But I think that if we look at who we are as people and the things in life that we need, that if you understand that you aren't living life the way that you want to live it, and you feel the need for growth, whether it's therapy, whether it's your own self-help, self-care type exercises. I'm a big proponent of therapy, and you'll hear me say that repeatedly because frankly, I think mental health at large should be treated the way that we treat physical health, if not more substantially, because it dictates all of that. But you know, there's so much that exists in our subconscious that we hold on to and we fear exposing. And I remember when I started going to therapy, the anxiety I would feel about like revealing things about myself that I knew I had to say if I wanted to achieve the growth that I wanted. But that meant lowering my guard on something that I was not wanting to. And so you do have this sort of, I don't know, it's a conflict, right? You're like, do I want the growth or do I want to hold on to this thing that I'm afraid to expose? And it's like, I err on the side of growth, and
it's a challenge.
Encourage people to do that.
It's a challenge.
And I think too, when you're sitting in that position of, you know, do I move forward? I think the way that I have felt is, do I want to see it? Like, what if I see all of that shit and I don't like myself? And that, and nobody else likes me, and I'm all alone. And then once I'm all alone, I'm gonna die. That's where my brain goes.
I think that's a reasonable. Okay, reasonable might be the wrong word. I think that is a common. I think that's a common feeling. I think that's a common feeling because it's all rooted in: are we going to be accepted by ourselves or by other people? Will we lose that sense of belonging? And what I would say to that, Jody Lynn, and I'm curious if you found this in those moments, or Walt as well, is like the growth that you achieve, even when you're like, do I want to see it? Do I want to witness this and have to deal with the consequence of that? Is it's almost never as bad as you think it's going to be. And even if it were, it's out there now. Like, you've named it, you've put it out there, and now there's nothing else to do but run right at that and like let it be what it is. Because if the people aren't going to like you for showing up authentically, then that's their loss, that's on them. And if you find yourself feeling like, well, I don't like that, is it shame associated with the fact that you exposed that, or that it happened and that you had to expose that? You should be proud of the fact that you put it out there and that you're leaning into it so you can grow. So, I mean, I'm hearing myself talk and I'm like, wow, when did I become an optimist? This is weird. Like,
Well, welcome to the circle. That's all I can tell you.
That's right. And I do agree with what you've said. When you put it out there, often 99.9% of the time, it's not as scary when you say it out loud. You take your power back by saying it out loud. And one of the most pivotal moments in my life was, I was going through a rough time. I thought I was a really awful person, and I called my best friend crying, like, "You're gonna hate me." And she's like, "What happened? Like, did you murder somebody? Do we have to hide a dead body? Like, what's going on?"
I like the friends that are always
I'm
asking
like,
that question, though.
right? Yeah. Great friend. She's like, "What happened?" And I told her that I cheated on my then boyfriend. And she's like, "Oh, that's it?" And it was that moment that I was like, wow, I have made this into a huge thing based on, all of the beliefs that I was holding. Not that, I want to justify that behavior or that it was the right thing to do, but I was convinced that she was going to hate me, that our, best friendship was going to be over, that I was an awful person, and that no one could ever forgive me for this mistake that I made. And in that moment, it was the collapsing of all of those walls. Like, okay, I made a mistake, but I'm not that mistake. I made
Yeah.
one, but I'm
Yeah.
not it.
100%. That's the right mindset to have. And I totally get it. I think internalized shame is probably just one of the biggest barriers to growth. And in my experience, I've held a lot of it. I mean, I joke around, I was raised Catholic, so like that Catholic guilt is a bit embedded in me. But
Yeah.
realistically, I'm not I'm not a practicing Catholic, so I don't know how much that actually made any sort of impact. I think it's just
It doesn't take much. All you have to do is have it imprinted on you. You don't have to be practicing anything. It's still going to be there. It's going to play.
That's fair. Yeah, you're right. And and I think what is challenging too, as we're coming into I feel like a new world where there is so much more discussion around emotional intelligence and who we are and how we show up, is that we weren't taught a lot of the things that we need to know. And we were taught a lot of sort of, I think, for lack of a better term, like primitive survival skills, not fully primitive, not the ones that would keep you alive in like an apocalypse, probably, but like the day to day life skills that you need without the attention to the emotional skills that you need. Like, I think so I'm 37. I think growing up, I was taught, basic emotional intelligence and things that are important and how you interact with other human beings. But I watched the way my sister's parenting her kids or my friends are parenting their kids, and just the way they speak to them about when they make a mistake or the fact that parents apologize. Who knew? Like there's this very substantial shift in the dialogue that's happening with children at a much younger age. And so I would venture to say that I even look at, Gen Zers and how they're really coming up in the world and showing up very fully to challenge the status quo, because they're sitting there going, I'm not okay with it. Now, we weren't okay with it either, but we didn't really understand that we could use our voice to empower the change, right? And so I feel like kind of being an elder millennial, as it were, is something that it's an interesting place to be, because I see us as the cycle breakers, the people who have kind of taken the knowledge that we got from my parents who are baby boomers and, other generations, and saying, okay, I'm not comfortable with X, Y, and Z. And then if you're raising kids or you're able to be a role model for younger people, then you can kind of show up and say, hey, these are things that I would have done differently when I was your age. And I find them to be really receptive of that. Like interns I've had at work and things like that. They're very, very emotionally astute. And I admire that for sure.
Yeah, totally like that. In fact, I would go so far as to say that's been true generation upon generation for probably centuries.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like tail end baby boomer, so I'm part of that generation. That generation was basically we were against everything. We were rebelling against anything and everything that you could possibly rebel against, and now we're the ones being rebelled against. But that's the progression. And then along with that progression is each generation that comes along, there's something to epigenetics. There's something to the idea that generationally we pick up data that wasn't available to the previous generation. So each generation is smarter. Each generation is more advanced. Each generation has more going on. They have a new perspective, and right now it's the Gen Zers. I don't even know what the next name is going to be after that, but whoever that next generation is going to be, they're going to have their own thing. It's going to outdo what the Gen Zers are doing. I mean, it's an ongoing evolutionary process, and I think it's pretty cool.
Well, I like that you said that way, Walt, also, because you're spot on, especially when you just consider access to information. I mean, the internet has changed the way that we learn and how we engage with each other. Obviously, the pandemic very much kind of leapfrogged, I think, the pace at which we may have actually gone more virtual. But, you know, I find that when you think about how we've changed, even since, I mean, I grew up primarily in the 90s, early 2000s, and how much has just changed in society since then, and the way that we engage with each other. I like the fact that I lived a very analog youth, because I feel like that gave me the social skills that I appreciate having, that I grew up with my parents being like, you need to be able to talk to adults. Like, you don't have to have adult conversations with adults, but you need to be able to stand in a room with adults and not just be like the shy kid that hides behind the leg, or the defiant kid that's creating chaos somewhere. I'm sure I was both of those things at points in time, but and I really appreciate that there wasn't a sense of, just throw something in front of them and distract them from the situation. And I see my sister doing a really great job with that. I mean, she's, as much as one can parent children in an analog way in such a digital age, I feel like she's doing a great job with that. But, there's also something to be said for the education that comes from having all of that information at their fingertips, and how quickly young kids are learning things too.
Yeah.
And how fast they're growing up.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Almost like terrifyingly so, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm like, you know too much. You're 5?
Yeah, my niece is 12 and she asks me questions and I don't know how to lie. So she'll ask me some pretty big questions and I'm like, oh geez, I'm gonna get in trouble for this one.
Oh, for sure. For sure. You should have
But
seen me
also-
wearing my shirt at my podcast shirt at my sister's before her kids could read. I can't do that anymore.
Yeah, no. But
All I
it's
can
also
say is-
good too, because they ask different kinds of questions and you get to be that person that that their safe space to come to ask some questions that they may not feel they can ask to somebody else.
Yeah, I love that role, and I've always joked around because I actively am not going to have kids, and even since I was a teenager, we were like, okay, I'll just be fun Aunt Nikki. And the fact that I actually get to live that out and be that person for them is super fulfilling. And I feel like that's such a beautiful way to, provide that type of care and connection for younger people too.
Yeah.
I think what you guys are also describing is what it's like to cross the line and become part of the older generations. There's like that dividing line, right? You're the upcoming generation. You're the ones that are cutting the teeth. You're the ones that are making all the changes and so forth. And then you move into the next realm. It's like, wait, whoa, I was over there before. What happened?
Oh yeah.
Now you're part of this other group over there. It's a different perspective.
When
It feels
did that
Totally.
happen? I learned that it basically, the way that I know that I am out of touch is when I've lost the ability to understand slang. Like I don't know what the kids are saying.
Oh yeah.
I don't know who musical artists are. And I'm like,
yes.
I really thought that I was not as old as I am. And it turns out that was wrong.
Yeah. All the acronyms. What does that stand for? What's that?
Yeah.
Something cool I don't even know about.
Exactly.
What?
And also, I'm not trying to know. That's really the tell, right? It's like I used to care. I used to feel like I needed to know. Now I'm like, I don't care. It's past. The moment's gone. I'll learn it if it's relevant. But there's almost the point where you're like, am I trying too hard because I do know? It's like sometimes you're you're not supposed to know. Just don't.
Yeah.
It's fine.
It's true. It's true. Well, it's also been affected again by the technology, which you were mentioning a moment ago, because now you don't know what the acronym is. You just Google it, but 40 years ago, if you didn't know what the acronym was, you were asking everybody for the next week. Do you know what this is?
Yeah.
Because there was no other source of information.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. It definitely changes the dynamic too, because it also, I think, it creates a lot faster pace of change because the communication proliferates so rapidly. I mean, just thinking about everything that I've witnessed. I was really anti TikTok for a long time. I was like, I don't understand TikTok. I didn't understand Snapchat. I'm not all of a sudden going to understand this. What I found really fascinating about TikTok, even though I'm like not great at keeping myself relevant on social media, I feel like the beauty in it is there's a raw way that people are communicating there,
Oh yeah.
and that they're communicating just with anybody, anybody, anywhere, anytime, the across age ranges, across geographies.
Yeah.
Like, it's so powerful, and frankly I think that's why it's concerning to people. And I think what really is amazing about that is that there's exposure to all of these things that we didn't have exposure to before, because as much as, I mean, back in the day, think about, for some reason, Walter Cronkite is the person who comes to mind. And it's like, you had like a news source, right? And you were getting your news from the specific news source, and that was the information that you got.
Oh yeah.
And then it grew, and there were more places to get your news and media and whatnot. But now it's like, you don't even need those things. You can actually have people who are just on the scene being like, this situation is unfolding right now. Now,
Mhm.
granted, there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical about a lot of things these days. So I'm not being like everything that's on the internet is valid, but I do think that it's really powerful to see how people who otherwise wouldn't be able to share information now have this mechanism to do so. And to tie it into the point of human connection, I feel like as much as you can see these pockets of the internet where people are fighting each other and they're just being hateful and horrible, you're seeing this really beautiful amount of people come together and say, like, we're on the side of humanity, we're on the side of equality, we're on the side of what is right, what is just, and really thinking about it at not just a very small fraction of what society is in where we live and the people who surround us, but in like at a global scale, how does this impact people? Because you see these pockets of revolutions happening all over the place, and that's not by accident. That's because people are saying the truth about what's affecting change and why people need to be more aware.
You used a key word a moment ago, exposure. And I know what you meant when you used the word, but it actually is a word that cuts two ways. I think you meant this too. Because the person who's putting out the TikTok video, there's exposure there, but there's also the exposure of the person who's receiving it, who's uncomfortable about it, or who doesn't really resonate with it, and so they flick away to something else. But it came into their stream; it was right there, and they had to deal with it for a moment. That's an uncomfortable kind of exposure,
Yeah,
and
that's
that's
really
part of I think
interesting.
what you were talking about. That exposure that's jarring. It's a jarring exposure that basically says you're going to look at this other piece of the world for 30 seconds.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Walt, because it ties back to the conversation we were having a moment ago around needing to expose people to controversial, varying opinions and perspectives on things. And again, granted, like, not all content is content worth watching. Like, it doesn't matter where it's coming
No,
from. It just
I mean,
might not be
honestly, most
good.
of it isn't.
It might make me uncomfortable. Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, it's great, we should just let everybody do whatever they want. But I do feel like I've seen some content creators who have spoken to the fact, and my wife and I have done quite a few TikTok lives as well, where you're engaging with people who have opposing opinions on very fundamental things. And if you can do that with a sense of civility
Yes.
and acknowledge that that difference is, there doesn't need to be animosity. Now, I'm never going to agree, as somebody who is part of the LGBTQ community, that we shouldn't have equal rights. Like, that would be
Yeah.
absurd for me. So I'm not going to agree with somebody, and I'm probably not going to be like, you should be part of my inner circle. But I would like to understand why you feel that way. Why do you believe that? And learn if there is something that, maybe you don't know, or maybe it's just a matter, to your point, of interacting with people. Like, if you don't know somebody who falls into a category of people you don't like just inherently based on whatever belief system you have, then
Or
my
something
question
you've
is,
heard.
yeah, exactly. My question immediately is like, well, have you interacted with somebody who falls into that group of people? And I think that we need to be honest with ourselves about why those opinions and beliefs develop. Which, again, coming back to the name of my show, like, some of that was what I was doing for myself. It was like, why do I believe what I believe? Am I living with my belief system aligned to who I am today, not who I was raised to be. And nothing in regards to sort of like a lack of equality, but just my overall perspective on the world.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely true.
Absolutely.
In fact, I take that another level. The exposure concept that we're talking about here cuts in a lot of different ways. What I'm thinking about right now, people get upset about the political divide, not just here in the U.S., but there are political divides going on across the world, across the entire planet. And it's very common to have people say, well, it's like we're in end times. I mean, the whole structure is falling apart. Democracy is going away. I mean, authoritarianism is taking over. There's all these fears being expressed in that way. And I keep looking at it, specifically the political realm, from a different point of view from most people, because I have a political science background. And so I know the history of politics. And the two things that I like to point out to people who are in that kind of freaked out mode where politics is concerned is, first of all, if you really think this is bad, try reading about 19th century politics. That will absolutely flip you out. And then the second thing to point out is this stuff that is coming out now and has been coming out for the last, 10, 20 years, something like that, has been around all along. Mm-hmm. The only reason that you're flipped out about now is that it's in your face. It wasn't in your face before. Yeah. You probably didn't even know most of it was happening. But because we live in this instant information age, you can't avoid it anymore. And that's why you're really flipping out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I really like that perspective too, because I was not activated politically in any way, shape, or form growing up. Honestly, I felt like, why does it matter? I felt like the system was the system. And I will be honest, I do feel like to some degree that was probably by design. It was like, well, if they just think it's a well-oiled machine, they'll just let it keep running this way. And we did. And oops, like we should have been more aware earlier on. And so I think there have been some pivotal moments in the past decade or so where my eyes opened up to the reality of what the breakdowns are in the systems that we have in place. And to your point, Walt, I mean, I'm a fan of documentaries of all kinds. I love learning about history and the messed up things that have happened, and hope that, we don't repeat those things. But I think what you're touching on too is that we're not only uncomfortable with the reality that we're facing, we're plagued as to how we remedy the things that feel so big, right? Because like, where do you even start when it feels so unmanageable at like the point that you're at? And I was listening to, it was kind of like an interview podcast with this author. I think his name's Brian Klaus. I'll confirm that, but he wrote a book called Corruptible, and he answers a bunch of questions about just sort of the origin of power and the people who seek power. And his interview was just truly fascinating because it's talking about, I mean, honestly, like why psychopaths are often in power, and it's because they seek power, because they want power, because they want to control people.
Who knew?
Shocking, right? But I think one of the things that he says is like, so many people think that it's not fixable, and it is fixable. We just have to be very intentional and understand our inherent bias that contribute to the ongoing framework and supporting that, and figure out how to kind of decouple those things in larger ways, but understand that it's not just going to be like a lift and shift. This one's out, this one's in too. So I feel like we're at a weird point in history where it's like there's a lot of really big changes that need to happen, and then figuring out how to actually implement those changes is like this whole other beast that we're trying to manage at the same time.
I think there's also another thing going on here, which is that we live in a time where institutions across the board are crumbling. Government is one of those institutions. Corporations are one of those institutions. I mean, they're like a range. The churches, various kinds of churches, the crumbling is happening everywhere. And that's also part of what's freaking people out, because it's all crumbling. But what goes along with that is the crumbling is basically a way of describing the fact that people are saying, I'm kind of done with that.
Yeah, I love it. I'm like, let it crumble, but like, let's figure out what it looks like after it crumbles too. Because otherwise, like, if we don't have a plan, I'm not a fan of that.
Well, I think what also happens is when you start getting disaffected by what you're seeing crumbling outside, you look elsewhere. You say, well, what else is there? And really, I mean, this is what we talk about here on this show all the time. At some point, you're being encouraged through your circumstances to start looking within. Because it turns out none of the answers are out there. which is
Yeah.
really annoying, by the way.
Yeah, well, I like that that's the way you brought that together, because it's true. It's something that we can't expect there to be fundamental change externally if we don't acknowledge that we're somehow contributing to it. And I think about it even just when I was going through my divorce, and it was a very psychologically abusive situation for a long time. And I remember being in therapy and my therapist basically saying to me, like, you have to be accountable to the role that you played. It's not like this is your fault. This is, none of that. But it's the reality that there were things that I knew, that I felt, that I didn't trust. And because of that, I stayed in a bad situation longer than I should have. And
Sure.
I think if you extrapolate that to a societal level, that's sort of where we are with humanity. It's like
Yeah.
we've accepted this for far too long, and now we're realizing things need to change. But for this stuff to change, we have to actually acknowledge what we've done to contribute to this problem, and how can we then contribute to the solution.
I think we
Mhm.
also have to come to the point of saying, as counterintuitive as this is, I think I got to learn to be okay with the fact that it's a mess out there.
Yeah.
I just got to be okay with that. Because until I can be okay with it, all I'm going to do is make it worse. I'm just going to make things, I'm going to drive that vibration of, oh, this is so terrible. So I'm going to keep pushing it how terrible it is. And it's going to get more and more terrible. Now I'll make it more terrible. And oh my God, now it's really terrible. We got to do something about this.
And we're off a cliff.
Yeah, well,
right.
exactly. Well, Jody Lynn, when you were introduced, Walt had said that you're, am I correct, an abundance coach as well?
Yeah.
So how do you, I guess, how does that affect the way that you show up with like the mass sort of chaos / change / growth that we're seeing happening on a societal level? Because I feel like there's so much that we're experiencing right now that when you come from a place of abundance and not from a place of lack, it in my opinion, in my experience, it makes me feel like there's so much more potential and gives me a lot more hope.
I'm just going to mute my mic. This is going to take a while for Jody. Jody Lynn's just going to go off here. This is going to be great.
Oh God. Here we go. Well, you know what? I thank God for all of the work that I have done. So my other job is a financial advisor. So the financial world is also crumbling, lots of changes, things like that. And that's where I started my journey with abundance. It's realizing that abundance is more than just money. It's an overflow of joy and love and bliss and resources, which can include money, all of these things. But it's really understanding that we get stuck. And I think it's something that we've talked about. We get stuck in the way that we perceive things, and then we recreate that reality over and over and over again, whether we're conscious of it or not. And the layers of it are deep because of the societal programming that we've had. So I think it starts with really going within and asking, who the fuck? That's where it begins. Like, what am I believing? And is it these beliefs that, I picked up when I was a kid, whether they were taught or they were observed and we just ran with them? And are they serving me in this moment? Are they serving where the direction of my life that I desire to go next? So instead of creating from those past realities, we're creating from this now moment, and seeing that for me, this chaos, I've gone within and also without, like looking at the outside, my world. What do I really want that life to look like? That started in 2020 with the lockdowns. We were sequestered at home, work from home, everything like that. And I was like, yay, an opportunity to start breaking some cycles that I was really entrenched in. Like, I have to be at the office. Why? Why do I have to do that? I started asking why about every single thing I did in my life. And that's a constant, ever-changing and fluid conversation that I think we as individuals need to have with ourselves to create that abundant life. And nature for me is the most beautiful expression of abundance. You look at the birds and they're not scared that, the financial system is crumbling. They're not paying taxes on the land over here. Like the life that they are living is so abundant. The grass didn't get a permit to grow, and you're not like, oh, I need to plant this and make sure it grows and watch over it. I need to be so involved in making that, grass grow, aka making money. It just grows and it just flourishes. The flowers flourish, and I'm learning tons about how weeds, aren't really bad weeds. A lot of them are nourishing for our body and things like that. So nature is such a beautiful expression of how abundant our lives are supposed to be. And when somebody says abundance is our birthright, I think that's what they're trying to say, is that you are the vibration of abundance. You are connected to nature. You are one with all of these things. So just letting go of the crap, like who the fuck, asking all of those questions and coming back to this space of who you truly are within.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that was such a really beautifully stated explanation, and also
Thank you.
very eye-opening as well. I connect to nature quite a bit myself as well. I find a lot of peace in it and gratitude in, I mean, even just when I'm out and about and being in lush British Columbia, we were up in
Yeah.
Whistler for the first time that I'd ever been there a couple weeks ago, and there are moments where I've got sunglasses on. I'm like, I have to take these off. I want to see like what I'm seeing. I want to experience it and all of the beauty that's there. We got to this lake at the top of a mountain, like bottom of a glacier type thing, and I was like, okay, well, obviously, like I hiked. I don't have a bathing suit on, but I just like kind of went in up to like my thighs because I was like, I want to experience this. I want to be part of this beauty, and I love that that is how it really has come together in the way that you explained it and what you've shared, because I share that sentiment. And I also feel like I've had that mentality of like coming from a place of lack. I graduated in '08 when the economy had crashed with a film degree. It was like, good luck with your life.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
And so it took me over a decade, almost a decade and a half, to really come to a place of, it's not about the money. It is, in that you said, right? It's a resource, and that resource can help us. But the way that my wife and I always talk about it is like, we want to have more money so that we can do more good for the world. And so
Mhm.
it's more about that than it is about, being money grubbing and just needing it. It's about like, what can you do if you have those resources, if you live that life of abundance, and how can you help share that abundance as well?
Mhm.
I love
Absolutely.
that. Somehow you managed to get that into 3 minutes. I don't know how you did that.
It came through. Just channeled it.
Just clip
On.
that out and put it on the
Kidding.
internet. Just like make that one just nice
That was a
clip for the
great clip.
show.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll clip it for TikTok. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
That'll be my first TikTok. But I think too, to add to that, when we're looking at and in the experience of abundance and how much we have to give, just with right now this conversation, how much we're giving of ourselves, our authentic selves, our hearts, communicating and having this beautiful connection, and thinking about the ripple effect that is having. Because I think a lot of people, they're like, oh, well, I don't have enough money, so I can't make a big enough impact. Well, if you continue to have that belief system, you won't make an impact. But if you see every single thing that you are doing is impacting the rest of the world, you see how magnificent that is, and you honor that, and you're grateful for that. It just magnifies it even more. And abundance, like attracts like. So you're going to get more of that back into your life, including more resources to do more of those things.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's amazing. I totally agree. And I think that that's something that we should also be teaching, right? There's so many things that I feel like can add tremendous value to our lives if we just know to look for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know why this is tying in my mind, but it is. I'm an advocate of alternative education. I actually helped to found an alternative school where the students were basically in charge. They ran the whole thing, which scares the crap out of most parents. But nevertheless, it worked very nicely.
I'd love to know more about that.
Oh, it's
So
cool. It's fun. It'll blow your mind, but the results that you see also blow your mind. It's really just incredible.
Oh, I bet.
But it reminds me of, this is what I was thinking about. It reminds me of I can't call it a study. It was an experiment that was done by a gentleman from India, an educator. This was, I'm going to say 20, 25 years ago, something like that. He went into one of the major cities in India. I think it might have been Mumbai, but I'm not 100% sure. But he went to one of the poorest neighborhoods, and it was a neighborhood where, of course, India is full of all kinds of languages, and not everybody speaks English, although it's one of the major languages of the country. But still, there are large chunks of the population that don't speak English, and this was one of those neighborhoods that the kids there had their one language. It was not English. That's all they knew. That there were no schools there. It was so poor. The kids just hung out in the street. They were playing in the street all day long. It was that kind of a situation. And he took a computer. This would have been the equivalent of an early PC, early Windows type computer, and had it modified to install into a wall of a building on the street at kid level, so that a kid could go interact with this thing. And then he plugged it into the internet, and he left it there for a year. No instructions, nothing. Just left it hooked up, ready to go, and came back a year later to see what had happened. And what he learned when he came back was that all the kids had discovered the computer. They had taught each other English. They had taught each other how to use the computer, and they had organized themselves into a school based on what they were drawing off the internet that they were now connected to.
That's insane and amazing.
But to me,
that's the power of humanity. That's the power of humanity. We look at it and we look at the mess that is happening in certain ways, but those moments, Walt, like that is why I keep holding on to hope, it's like, because there is something innate in our desire to grow, to learn, to find purpose.
And those
to make things better, like to grow in that way,
in a community way, right? Like I think that we've kind of skewed things. You said this earlier, Walt, about sort of the way things are crumbling from a governmental and corporate perspective, especially, where it's like we've kind of allowed ourselves to believe that that's the way that it is because there are people who want to just have that, that's the way it exists because it's serving them. But I really do believe that most people want to help each other. And if we can strategize in a way that fuels humanity from a more positive, equitable angle than like what you're just describing, right? Like any one of those kids could have hogged that computer, right? They didn't have to show other kids what they were learning, right? They could have held on to that knowledge, but they saw, as you point out, Jody Lynn, like the opportunity to share that. And I think that we as human beings, because we are community oriented, we also have that innate desire to share. And that assumes obviously like your survival's not threatened, because then like the reptilian brain gets in the way of that and you're like, this is mine, you can't have it. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about like what happens if you have the means to be able to share it. Most people will.
And that's a key portion, by the way, of what we discovered with that group, because they didn't have the means. There was no means at all. I mean, they barely had food to eat. There was no place, there were no schools, there was nothing. They had nothing at all. So they didn't even have their base level of the Maslow hierarchy of needs filled. It was empty. And they still managed to have this tremendous leap forward. What it tells to me is we all have that in us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just those kids. There was nothing particularly unusual about those kids. Those kids are simply representative of a larger humanity. We all have that within us. All we're really in the process of doing right now, this is my opinion, all we're really in the process of doing right now is learning to trust that within ourselves.
Yes, 100% agree with you. And it's one of the hardest things to do. It's so hard because we've been taught through just the way society is over the generations that we've all lived or have experienced, that we are supposed to do things a certain way. And if that conflicts with what you trust within yourself, now you have to challenge that. And I definitely think this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Jody. It's like, but if you acknowledge it, then what happens, right? And so it's a balance, and I think we're all navigating it the best we can. And conversations like this definitely inspire that desire to keep moving forward and keep creating that change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Change is frightening, but it's also exciting.
Yes, exactly. Well, because if we do nothing, then what do we get? The same thing we've had, or possibly worse. Like, that sounds terrible.
Yeah,
I don't want to do that.
No.
There was a lyric to an old song that said, well, nothing from nothing leaves nothing. That's about it.
Turn it into a shirt.
That's right. Hey, this has been fun. I always get a little sad after an hour because, it's like we're flying along like, oh God, it's over? Really? Shoot.
Well, I'm happy to have another conversation. This has been so enjoyable. I appreciate both of you and your perspectives and for having me on. I like being on the other side of the mic and having an organic conversation like this is just right up my alley. And I'm really grateful for what you both are doing with this show and keeping these important conversations happening. Get that exposure, as we've been saying, is just super important. And so I'm happy to help promote it as much as I can.
Wonderful. We love that. I want to promote you a little bit too, right here and now. Jody Lynn knows where I'm going with this, but I noticed something about a year and a quarter ago that kind of falls through the cracks in this internet-driven world that we have. We kind of, you talked a number of times about content, and this absolutely fits into the realm of content. You create a lot of content. You have been for the last, 4 or 5 years on your podcast. I've created a lot of content here. Jody Lynn has helped create a lot of content. A lot of content gets consumed by people we've never met, we've never seen. We don't know what happened. We hope that they got some value out of it. They probably did because they kept coming back. And it doesn't have to be just in podcasts. You mentioned blogs. It can happen in a blog. It can happen in social media posts. It can happen all over the place. But there's all this content that's being created that's helping people that we never know about, and we never get recognized for it. I think that's not a good thing. So I like to say on behalf of those people that you've never met and you've never seen, thanks for that content you've been creating, because you are making a difference in this world.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. And I appreciate it. It's definitely, like I said at the beginning, you have to lead with purpose. And I think when you lead with purpose, then you find a lot of joy and gratitude for the things that you do, even when the resources might not be exactly what you want them to be at a given moment. That I think is just, it's such a fraction of why any of us do what we do or why we should do what we do. So I'm so appreciative to both of you.
Thank you.
One last thing, we got to remind people the podcast is called Who the Fuck?
Yes.
By the way, how do you spell that in your domain name? I'm curious.
It is whothefck.com.
Okay.
The actual full domain was taken, and I also thought it was better to just be able to say whothefck.com.
Okay. All right. So, I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes too, so people can find that. Because we want people to find the podcast too.
Absolutely.
How can you record now? How many episodes do you do? Like a month or something?
So I'm putting out one a week.
Okay.
So just kind of keeping that machine rolling as smoothly as possible. I'm trying to ever improve the quality of the video podcast too, to give a little bit more refinement there, because my background is in video production. So I feel like now that my contract's ending for my tech role, I'll have a little bit more time to dedicate towards the little nuances that I feel like can enhance the actual watching experience for people too. So whether you're listening or watching, I'm greatly appreciative. So you can follow.
About 99% of our listeners are audio only. Not too many of them are seeing the video, but for those listeners, let me tell you, she's got this wonderful active background going on.
Yeah,
it's cool stuff.
Super cool.
It's funny. So this actually was. It moves when you play music, but I didn't realize until I was podcasting one day that it was happening because I'm on headphones. So if I stop talking, it'll stop moving. But if I talk, it just sort of radiates rainbows, which I think is just ridiculous and amazing all at the same time. So I
think it's cool.
Thank you.
It's beautiful. It's truly beautiful. And of course, very symbolic that the rainbow colors make all of it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That's so good stuff.
How gay can you be? This gay?
Yeah, right. Well, it's appropriate. This is the daily dose of happy. Why not be gay?
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, and I immediately think of abundance, like rainbow. There's a pot of gold on either side. So
boom.
Yeah, boom.
Where is it?
It's there.
It's there. You just have to know how to see it. That's all.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
That's right.
Yeah. Hey, maybe in feng shui, that's your money corner. I don't know.
Well, now I have to Google it.
Yeah, totally. That would be awesome if that actually lines up. You have to let us know.
That'd be really cool if that came out of this. Yeah, I'd like that. That'd be really good. All right. Nikki LaCroce, thanks so much for joining us. This is really
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've both been
we'll
amazing.
have to arrange to have you come back again sometime.
Absolutely happy to do so whenever. And I'd love to chat with either or both of you on my show as well. So I'm grateful we've made this connection and should definitely keep the conversations going.
All right. Jody Lynn, I think we did it again. What do you think?
I agree. It was a great episode.
Yeah. Well,
it was over the rainbow.
It was over. There we go. Just hold it together right there. Love it. Absolutely love it. Thank you, Jody Lynn. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you to our podcast listeners everywhere. We'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.